You walk into the gym, you're ready to train, and you are immediately presented with a whole bunch of ways to potentially mess up your warm-up. From jumping right to your work weight, not a good idea, to getting out your percentage chart or your warm-up app to structure your whole warm-up process, definitely not necessary, to getting on the rower and doing some rowing and some mobilizing and doing a whole bunch of other silly nonsense that takes up a bunch of your precious time and also doesn't add anything productive to your training for the day. Also not a good idea. What we really want from a warm-up is something that is effective. We want it to be efficient, relatively simple also. So with that in mind, we're going to cover the 3 basic principles that make up a good warm-up. And then along the way, we're also going to cover some tips that will help you out, as well as some common mistakes to avoid. Principle number 1, we'll try to keep this relatively quick. Your workout should prepare you for your work set. And in order to do that, you're generally going to take roughly even jumps. So generally speaking, we're going to start with the empty bar. We'll come back to that in a little bit because there is an exception there. But you're going to start with the empty bar and you're going to be taking roughly even jumps on the way up to get up to your working weight. Where there is going to be a smaller jump, you typically want that smaller jump in weight to be nearer to your work weight as opposed to having the smaller jump bias towards the beginning of the warm-up. Principle number 2, your warm-up should not exhaust you by the time you get to the work set. So for example, here's what not to do. Somebody's coming in, they're going to squat 225 pounds for 3 sets of 5 that day. They're walking in, they're going to do the empty bar for 2 sets of 5. That's great, but then don't do the following: 65 pounds for a set of 5, 85 pounds for a set of 5, 105 for a set of 5, 125, so forth and so on, right? You're doing so many sets and you're doing so many reps by the time you get there that you're going to have spent more energy, far more energy than you absolutely need to get you ready. So your warm-up should not exhaust you. And we're going to do some examples that cover these principles so you can see this in action. Principle number 3, the warm-up should in general be convenient whenever possible. So for example, that same person who's warming up to squat 225 pounds, if on the way up they're trying to decide between do I squat 90 pounds for a warm-up set or 95 pounds for a warm-up set, they're going to choose 95 pounds for a warm-up set. To load 90 on the bar, you've got to grab a 10 for each side, another 10 for each side, and then a 2.5 pound plate on each side. Whereas to load 95 pounds on the bar, they're just putting a 25 pound plate on the bar. It's much simpler to load. The chance of making a loading or a math error is much less, and for somebody who squats 225 pounds, there's no real big difference between squatting 95 or 90 as far as doing a warm-up. All right, so we've got the 3 principles down. Let's start going through some examples. In the process, we're going to cover some common tips that will be useful for you, as well as some common mistakes to avoid, right? So let's start with, let's say somebody's coming in and they're going to squat 225 pounds. This could be benching 225 pounds, doesn't matter. We're just going to start with 225 pounds. Good rule of thumb, good common tip that we give people is start with the empty bar for 5 reps and 2 sets. And generally speaking, you don't need to come in and get on the bike or get on the rower. If you really want to, that's certainly fine, you can. But generally speaking, the lift is the warm-up. The lift is the warm-up, right? So you're going to start with the empty bar, 5 reps, 2 sets. Some people might prefer to do 3 sets or 4 sets of 5 if they're feeling a little bit stiff or a little bit, the joints are feeling a little bit more crunchy than usual. That's perfectly fine. Also, there's nothing wrong with doing a set of 10 instead of 2 sets of 5. But most people's shoulders appreciate kind of getting out from underneath the bar after that first set of 5. So let's just say empty bar, 5 reps, 2 sets. Then we're going to make roughly even jumps. They don't need to be perfectly even. And like I mentioned earlier, if there's going to be a smaller jump, we're going to bias it towards the end. But for a person squatting 225 pounds, most of those jumps can be done using what we commonly refer to as plates and quarters, right? Plates are commonly referred to in the weightlifting world, or in the training world, we're talking about 45-pound plates. I realize everything is a plate, but when somebody says plates, they're typically talking about 45-pound plates, and quarters would be a 25-pound plate, right? So we can go from 45 to 95 pounds. We can go from 95 to 135. This is a 25 on each side. This is a 45 on each side. Are those precisely even jumps? No. Obviously, we've got a 50-pound jump and a 40-pound jump, and then here we've got a 50-pound jump, right? 185 is a 45-pound plate and a 25-pound plate on each side. So you've got 40 to 50-pound jumps for these first 3 too. And generally speaking, this is how we're doing the principles here, right? It's going to prepare you for the work set, right? That's why we're making roughly even jumps. It's also not going to, that was principle number 1, it's also not going to exhaust you. That was principle number 2, which is we're tapering the warm-up. So ignoring the empty bar, we're typically going to recommend a 5-3-2 scheme, and then any warm-ups you have after that, if you have more warm-ups after that, and as you get stronger, you very likely will, then we're just going to recommend singles, right? So here we've got 5-3-2-1. If this person had more warm-ups than that, they might have another single after that. You get the idea. So you want to taper them so that the heavier the weight gets, the fewer reps that you're doing, so you're not using really any more energy than you have to. You're still getting plenty ready for the work set, but you're also not exhausting yourself yourself in the process, right? So we're making roughly even jumps. Now, could we still apply that, right? Could we go from 185 to 225? That would be another 40-pound jump. Then we'd have 50 pounds, then we'd have 40 pounds, then we'd have 50 pounds, then we'd have 40 pounds. So that fits in with the theme of roughly even jumps. Sure, you very well might be able to. However, it's possible that making the jump from 185, you're getting close to your work set now, okay? So making the jump from 185 to 225 might be a little bit big of a jump. You might appreciate one more warm-up. And here's where a common tip comes in. A very useful tip is, after you've been training for a while, if you do something around 90% of your work set for a last warm-up single, that's probably going to be a pretty good last warm-up, right? So if you're thinking about 225, that's my work set for the day. What's 90% of this? It doesn't have to be precise, but if I'm thinking 90%, that just means I'm taking 10% off, right? So I move the decimal over one place, I get 22.5 pounds that I'm going to subtract. Nobody wants to subtract 22.5 pounds, so I'm just going to subtract 20 pounds in my head, right? If I take 20 pounds off of this, I think, okay, a warm-up of 205 pounds for a last single is going to be a pretty good place to be, right? So how does this kind of go with all three of our criteria, right? Well, the jumps are roughly even, but I do have a smaller jump here towards the end. I've got a 20-pound jump and a 20-pound jump. So I am certainly preparing myself for the work set. I'm also not exhausting myself by the time I get to the work set. I've got a 5, a 3, a 2, and a 1, so I'm tapering it as we go, and we've bowed to convenience wherever possible, right? This person is strong enough that most of their warm-ups can be done with either 45-pound plates or 25-pound plates, the exception being that as you get closer to the work set, you might want to be a little bit more precise with some of your warm-up selections. All right, let's take a look at another example. And here we're also going to talk about the downsides of using percentage charts and warm-up apps and stuff like that. And let's also talk about the length. How much time should a warm-up take? And let's first talk about the actual warm-up itself, right? So now somebody's coming in and they're going to squat or they're going to press or they're going to bench, whatever it is. It's going to be 105 pounds. So we're still going to start with the empty bar, 45 pounds, 5 reps, 2 sets. You'll notice I haven't talked about the deadlift yet. There's a little bit of an exception when it comes to the deadlift because we don't ever start with an empty bar for the deadlift because we want the deadlift to sit at the right height off the ground, so we've got to have some full-size plates. So we'll come back to deadlift here in a moment. But if we're going to jump to 105, we're going to work up to 105 rather. We're going to make 45 pounds, 5 reps, 2 sets. Going to 65 pounds seems like a reasonable jump. We've got another 20-pound jump there, so that's 20 pounds from 45 to 65, 20 pounds from 65 to 85. Could we go from 85 to 105? Possibly, but it might be nice to have one more warm-up in there, so we've got 95 pounds right there, right? So we've got roughly even jumps. It's preparing us in a sensible manner. We're also tapering the warm-ups. So we've got principle 1, it's preparing us. Principle number 2, we're not exhausting ourselves. We're tapering the warm-ups. First weighted warm-up is 5. Second weighted warm-up is 3. Last weighted warm-up is a 2. Could you do a 1 instead? Could you do 5-3-1 instead of 5-3-2? Sure, I'm just sticking with that 5-3-2, and if we had more warm-ups, they'd be singles, right? And it turns out this kind of works in with that last warm-up being 90%. Now here you'll notice it's for a double instead of a single, but that's fine. As this person gets stronger, that 90% for a last warm-up is probably going to be a single instead of a double, right? And we've bowed to convenience whenever possible, and this is where, right? 95 pounds is easy to load. 65, 85, also very easy to load, right? All you're putting on is a 10 on each side for 65, a 10 on each side for 85. You use something like a percentage chart or a warm-up app. A, you've got to get the thing out. B, with something like a percentage chart, every time your work weight changes, all of your warm-ups, or at least a lot of your warm-ups, are going to change. And a lot of times you're going to get numbers like, you're going to get a number like 90 instead of 95 or something like that. Like I mentioned earlier, nobody wants to use 90 pounds. Just use 95 pounds instead, okay? So warm-up charts, warm-up apps, stuff like that, they're kind of like the diapers of the lifting world, right? They're real useful. They can be real useful in the beginning for avoiding making a mess of things. But in the long run, it will be faster, it will be quicker, it will be simpler, it will be more efficient for you to write your own warm-ups, because also another thing that happens is the stronger you get, the less your warm-ups change over time. Somebody who's been training for a long time, let's say somebody who squats 405 pounds, right? That person has probably been using the same first 3 or maybe even 4 sets on their warm-ups for a long time. Maybe only the last warm-up weight is changing, or the last 2 warm-up weights are changing. Somebody who squats 405 for 3 sets of 5, they're probably doing the empty bar for 2 sets of 5. They're going 135. In fact, let's go ahead and write this out. Somebody's going to squat 405 pounds, right? So they're going to start the same way, 45 pounds, 5 reps, 2 sets. They're going to go 135 by 5. They're going to go probably 225 by 3. That's supposed to be a 5. They're probably going to go 315 by 2. And they're probably going to go 365 by 1. And then they're ready to do their work set, 405 by 5 by 3. Now, I purposely chose a big number here because I could choose some convenient weights along the way, but this applies to people squatting less than this, of course, as well. The point is, for somebody squatting 405, that 135, 225 pounds, 315 pounds, that's going to be pretty much their first weight selections for a while, all right? They're going to have used those for a while, and they'll probably continue to use those for a while. They're convenient. It allows you to taper things as you go along. So the stronger you get, the less your warm-ups will change. The longer you train, the less your warm-ups will change, unless, of course, you're using a percentage chart. That's going to change every single time you plug in a new number. If you're using a warm-up app, it's going to change every single time you plug in a new number. So avoid those. They are the diapers of the lifting world. They can be useful in the beginning, but you want to outgrow them. All right, let's move on to the deadlift now. Let's also talk about, because I forgot to talk about this earlier, let's talk about how long it should take you to warm up, right? We talked about, not using the rower or not using the bike unless you really want to, but also how long should you rest in between your warm-ups? And the answer is you really don't have to rest at all. These are warm-up weights, so they're not particularly taxing. Yes, they get a little bit more taxing as they get heavier, but you're also doing fewer and fewer reps as you go along. And so the rest is simply the act of changing the weight. So let's talk about someone who's deadlifting here, right? So let's say they've already squatted that day. They've also already pressed that day, and now they're moving on to the deadlift. So because they've already squatted, their hips, their legs, their back, they're already pretty warm, so they're going to deadlift 285 pounds today. So they're going to start with 135 pounds for one set of 5, not 2 sets of 5. Remember, with the deadlift, you always want to start with some full-size plates on the bar. So obviously 45-pound metal plates fit the bill there, but if you're deadlifting a lighter weight, like maybe your deadlift is only 105 that day or something like that, we go back to our previous example with that press or that bench, you're probably going to need to start with some bumper plates, right? You're going to need to start with like some 10-pound bumper plates, maybe some 15-pound bumper plates, something that gets it up to the right height off the floor. If you don't have bumper plates, you may need to create a stack of some sort or start with a rack pull inside the rack so you're pulling from the correct height. But let's just assume that we've got this. You'll notice we're just doing one set of 5 there. Even though it's our first set, we're not doing 2 sets of 5 like we're doing with the empty bar. Remember, this person has already squatted, so their hips, their legs, their back, it's already warm. They don't need to. If deadlift happens to be, and this may happen over time as your program changes, if you have a heavy deadlift day, you may decide to deadlift first. If this happens to be your first lift of the day, you might decide to do 135 for 2 sets of 5 instead of 1 set of 5. That would be a reasonable approach as well. But you'll notice the same principles apply, right? We're making roughly even jumps, and if there are some smaller jumps, we're going to bias them toward the work set. You'll also notice that we're tapering the warm-up as we go along, and we're generally bowing to convenience whenever possible. In terms of bowing convenience, quick tip, don't use 2.5-pound plates in your warm-up. In general, maybe if you're lifting less than 100 pounds or something like that, yeah, sure, you might absolutely want to use 2.5-pound plates in your warm-up, especially for your last warm-up. But if you're lifting over 100 pounds, especially over 200 pounds, generally speaking, you can avoid using 2.5-pound plates in your warm-ups. That way, every single weight that you lift will end in the number 5. It makes the math a little bit easier, and you don't have to get out the 2.5-pound plates. Now, the 2.5-pound plates are certainly going to be important for your work sets, and eventually for like the press and the bench and stuff like that, 1.25-pound plates become very important for your work sets. And that's true for the press and the bench for everybody, and for gals on the squat and the deadlift, and for everybody as they get older especially as well, right? But in general, if you can eliminate the 2.5-pound plates in your warm-ups, especially your earlier warm-up sets, that's going to make it more convenient. So what are we doing? We're going 135, we're putting on 25s on each side, we're doing a triple, then we're taking off the 25s. Now we've got 2 big plates, 2 45-pound plates on each side, we're doing a double, and then we're doing 255 for a single. We're talking about rest before, right? Just the act of changing the plates will provide enough rest. Now, the lone exception to that is after your last warm-up, yeah, then you might want to rest, a couple of minutes, maybe 3-4 minutes or something like that before actually doing your work set. But in general, the act of changing the weight is the rest. Could you rest longer? Absolutely. If you've got the time to spend in the gym and you enjoy it, that's fine. But a lot of people, we've got to get in, we've got to get the workout done, we've got to get out, right? So this is the way to save time in your training. Don't rest between your work sets. Excuse me, you do need to rest between your work sets. Don't rest between your warm-ups. Just change the weights and go. All right, our last example, we're going to do a 125-pound deadlift. So if somebody's deadlifting 125 for the day, they're obviously not going to start with 135 pounds, so we can't use those nice 45-pound metal plates. So we're going to need bumper plates, like I mentioned earlier, to get the bar up to the right height off the floor. Or if we don't have bumper plates, we might make a stack, or we might do a rack pull, set it up inside the cage, set it up inside the squat rack. That puts us at roughly the same height as a deadlift. Let's assume we've got bumper plates, so we're going to have 10-pound bumper plates on each side. We go from 65 to 85 to 105. Those are 20-pound jumps. Could we make another 20-pound jump? Very possibly, but it might be nicer to have a little bit of a smaller jump from 105 to 115 and likewise from 115 to 125. So that whole 90% of the work weight for a last single tends to work pretty well. You don't really try to figure out 90%. It's kind of a weird thing to figure out, right? Instead, what you do is you figure out 10% and then subtract that. Gives you the same result. It gets you to that 90%. 10% is very easy. You move the decimal over again like we did earlier. We get 12.5. Nobody wants to deal with 12.5 in their head, so let's just say 10. We subtract 10. That's how we get that 115 right there, right? So we're making roughly even jumps, and if anything, they're getting smaller as we go along. Also, you can see we're tapering the warm-ups here. 5, 3, 2, 1. We're not resting in between those warm-ups. We are technically resting a little bit. That's just the changing of the weights, and that's sufficient rest. And then we're definitely going to rest a couple minutes after we pull that 115 for a single. We'll rest 2, 3, 4 minutes, something like that. And then we're ready for 125 pounds for a set of 5. Now, we work with a lot of people in their 60s, 70s, 80s, people who potentially have never touched a barbell before. People come in a very detrained situation. They may not be deadlifting 125 on day one. They may not be deadlifting 65 pounds on day one. They might not even be deadlifting 45 pounds on day one, right? So in that case, you can't start with even an empty 45-pound bar. In that case, you're going to need to get yourself a lighter barbell. 65 pounds for somebody who deadlifts 125 pounds is a reasonable starting point. If your work weight that day is, let's say, 55 pounds, you probably don't want to start with an empty 45-pound bar because that's darn close to your work weight. So bear in mind, you may need to get a lighter barbell. We'll link to some below, but they make 5-kilogram barbells, that's 11 pounds. They make 10-kilogram barbells, that's 22 pounds. They make 15-kilogram barbells, that's 33 pounds. They make them in more American units as well, right? You can get a 15-pound aluminum bar. You've got these options. You want to make sure that you can start for your initial warm-up with something that is very, very manageable. So anyway, a little bit longer of a warm-up video than I had originally intended, but this should cover kind of all of the details that you encounter in the warm-ups. If there's something that I'm missing, feel free to let me know in the comments below. Ask me there, and as always, we hope this helps you get stronger and live better.